Hello everyone, I'm Nikki from Civic Square and I'm really excited to introduce our next two speakers for the event. Sway, we've got Dr Pragya Agarwal, author of Sway, and Joy Warmington, who's the Chief Executive of Birmingham Race Action Partnership, also known as BRAP. So this afternoon's event is exploring unconscious bias, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about the book if you haven't already seen it. Luckily I've got a copy here. And Sway is, I'm going to read some blurb from the book. Have you ever been told to smile more, been teased about your accent, or had your name pronounced incorrectly? If so, you've probably faced bias at some point in your everyday life. We like to believe that we're all fair-minded, but we all carry biases that we may not even be aware of. So for the first time, we have a book that unravels the way we have implicit or our implicit or unintentional biases, which affect the way we communicate and we interact with other people. Sway uncovers the science behind some of this unintentional biases, and it uses real-world stories, which Pragya hopefully will share. I won't say too much about Sway because that's the conversation that Joy and Pragya are going to have, but I will just do a brief intro about Pragya and Joy. Dr Pragya Agarwal is a behavioural and data scientist, and she's also a freelance journalist. She's the winner of the Diverse Wisdom Award from Hay House, and she was named as one of the top 100 influential women in social enterprise in the UK. Congrats on that, Pragya. And she's also one of the 50 people creating change in the UK-India corridor. And she, on the high and mighty list, and recently, not connected to Sway, but Pragya also single-handedly put together a 4-day online festival in the middle of lockdown, celebrating the work of South Asian writers. I'm not going to say too much about the next bit of information because I know Pragya's kind of not at liberty to say, but she's also recently signed a 2-book deal, so there'll be further works coming from Pragya. And just to introduce Joy, but people in Birmingham and beyond will be familiar with Joy's work. She's a CEO of BRAP, Birmingham Race Action Partnership, and she's engaged in the training and development of leadership at an organisational level. Joy's expertise has been sought after by many organisations, including the Department of Health, the Cabinet Office, the Department of Education, local and international organisations. Joy has a PhD and she's accredited to deliver, interpret and coach against implicit bias. So when I first came across the opportunity to host Pragya, Joy was the first person who came to mind, thinking, I thought, well, if there's anyone in Birmingham who knows about unconscious bias, Joy's the person. So hence Joy hosting this conversation. Before I hand over to Joy and Pragya, I just want to let everyone know that the chat is open and there will be opportunity to ask Pragya or Joy questions. And now, Joy, I'm going to mute myself and Pragya, and I shall hand over to you. So thank you both.
Thank you,
Joy.
Thank you, Nikki. It's good to see you, actually. And I just wanted to congratulate you and your colleagues for this event. It's been, I've not been able to hop onto lots of it, but I'm hoping to be able to do a little bit more tomorrow. So just so you know a little bit about what we're going to be trying to do this afternoon. As Nikki said, I run an organisation, a charity called BRAP. It doesn't actually stand for Birmingham Race Action Partnership, so forget that bit. We used to be Birmingham Race Action Partnership, and we formally changed what we did and where we did it about sort of 10 years ago. So I just wanted to make that clear, just in case anyone is confused. And I have a copy of the book, which I will show you. Because actually one of the things that the organisation does, the charity that I work for, is we're trying to think more critically about how we move towards a more equitable society, a society where we are more confident in our diversity. And unconscious bias is one of the tools, one of the many things that we use to support people to get there. And so we absolutely ages ago decided we were going to train in being able to deliver the implicit bias test, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through the conversation, Pragya. And also we deliver workshops, interactive workshops on bias, which I'm sure we'll talk about too. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I suppose my first question for you, because I'm sure people Some people may not have the book, but why did you? There's so much about unconscious bias. It's a very popular subject and quite a controversial subject, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the controversy through the discussion. But why did you write it? Why did you write the book?
Yeah, hi. I agree. It's become quite a popular thing recently, especially in the last few years. As I mentioned in the book came about as kind of a culmination of my own academic interests. So during my PhD and afterwards as an academic, I was doing a lot of work in kind of technology and bias. I was really interested in the whole notion of objectivity of technologies and how what interpretation of the world and the data sets we see and who decides it and why, and the whole notion of power and privilege that's built into the data and technologies. And I was doing a lot of work about mapping people's notion of sense of place and space. Um, and and that kind of led me into also looking at how biases are inbuilt into people. And we talk about uncertainty in data, but that comes from the bias that people already carry within them. So it's a manifestation of the biases that exist in the society. It also comes as obviously as a combination of, as kind of from my personal experiences moving to the UK as an immigrant, as a very young single parent doing a master's and PhD, as a woman in STEM, as the first female lecturer appointed in a leading engineering department ever, as a woman of color in predominantly white spaces mostly, and all those kind of things. Growing up in India as one of three girls, which is quite a bit of patriarchal society, colorism, and all those kind of issues. I've always experienced that and thought very deeply about those things. So my academic interests and research and my personal experiences were kind of colliding together all the time. And I was doing a lot of work about outreach, about accessibility and inclusivity as an academic as well, and how we bring in more women in STEM, and how we talk about people of color or students of who are non-white, or minority ethnic communities, how they fit into these academic environments. After I left full-time academia, I went and I started doing some inclusivity consultancy with a lot of organizations. And I started noticing that people were using unconscious biases a lot, and unconscious bias training and what it really represents. And I found that there was real danger that it was becoming a buzzword, kind of a trendy word, a box to be ticked. And I really wanted to bring a whole interdisciplinary aspect lens to this topic and think about what biases are, how they're formed, where do they exist, how they manifest, and just really, bring a whole lot of research and case studies and real world examples together in a book so that we understand it more deeply. And then once we become aware of it, then we can do something about it. So it's a long-winded answer.
No, it's not a long-winded side. And actually, I have dipped into your book, and I do like some of the real life examples and stuff. I mean, you talked a little bit about unconscious bias being a bit of a buzzword. Are you concerned then that you're adding to the buzz by by writing this book, by talking about unconscious bias?
No, I on the contrary, I think the buzz is good. I think we need to be aware of it. I think we need to be aware that racism, sexism, or all the different kind of biases that exist in our society do not always have explicit actions, explicit outcomes that we can really see and say. And there are implicit ways that these biases can manifest as well, and those are as much important in terms of individual accountability and responsibility, but also the systemic and structural biases and inequities that exist in our society. And I really hope that this book, and what I wanted to do with this book, is to create a non-judgmental space, a reflective space for people to read through it, everybody to read through it and think, yes, actually, I am biased as well. And I have these biases which I haven't reflected on. And I know bias can be a very emotive word and people get really defensive about it. And that's what I really wanted to do in this book, to show that, yes, I've reflected on my biases and there are some scientific basis to these biases. They're not hardwired in them like media sometimes makes it out to be. It is our responsibility to understand how they impact our decisions and interactions and how important it is to understand that. And people who've read it have said the same thing, that they've, for the first time, really understood their own biases and what is happening in society, and irrespective of ethnicity or class or caste or whatever. And I really hope this adds to the discussion about bias in a very non-judgmental, objective, scientific manner, in an accessible manner.
Well, let's just get into that discussion, because I mean, I don't have as much expertise in this. I wouldn't pretend to as you do, but we have done a lot of work and training and development around it. And I think for people that might be listening, it might be really helpful to get into some of this. Well, what are we talking about when we're talking about biases? And one of the things that that struck me when I was reading the book is that you talk about, I think you call it systemic or structural biases, and I'm slightly concerned about that, because I use, when we talk about biases, we talk very distinctly about prejudice, we talk about structural discrimination. We talk about world ideological viewpoints. And part of the reason that we do that is we don't want people to believe that everything is accidental and involuntary. And I suppose it would be good for us to just throw a little bit of the terminology around a little bit. So what are you talking about when you're talking about implicit bias? And why have you described things as biases, whereas potentially I wouldn't? Does that make sense?
How would you describe them, though?
Well, I suppose I use I use a kind of terms implicit bias. We talk a lot about the different types of biases, and very much mirrors some of the things that you talk about in the book. So attribution, confirmation, all of those different types of biases. But where I think I see a slight deviation, and it may be not a deviation at all, is when we're working with people, I don't want them to believe that everything they do is actually unconscious and that there's nothing they can do to control anything. And I think that would be my one criticism of lots of different types of unconscious bias training that I've seen. And I don't know whether you know, the Equality and Human Rights Commission did a review. Did you see the review of unconscious bias training in 2018? And they were quite critical about the approach. So we've sort of taken on a lot of that. But I'm getting into a long-winded answer as well. But I suppose I make the distinction in the work that we do, in the training and development work we do, around some of the things that we might not notice as well, and some of the things that we absolutely notice and do deliberately.
Yeah, I know you haven't had the opportunity to read through the whole book, because what I say is absolutely, I'm not propagating the myth that everything is unconscious, and because it's unconscious, we don't take accountability or responsibility for it. Actually, the opposite. I'm trying to shatter that myth that some of these, yes, there are these cognitive biases and they occur a lot. And I talk from a very scientific perspective about these shortcuts that we have, and we use the way we process all the information that's coming to us. And when we process it quite quickly, very hastily, when we are distracted, when we are tired, we tend to fall back on these templates that already exist in our brain, and we use these lazy shortcuts and lazy stereotypes sometimes. And then when that happens, we are more likely to fall back on our pre-existing biases. But if we take time with these things, then we would actually make a rational decision, and we would weigh up the different options and not generalize. It's the generalization that leads to it. And I also talk in detail about the difference between carrying these stereotypes that a lot of us carry sometimes, and the activation of these stereotypes. And that is absolutely under our control, about whether we let these stereotypes be activated. And I also say in the book that I do not believe that these biases are hardwired into us. Yes, there are some biases. We take cognitive biases are important for decision making, and that's how our brain works. So I look at the neuroscience and I look at evolutionary theories, and I lead on to the fact that actually a lot of these biases are learned through life. And so if they are learned, they can be unlearned as well. And just saying that they are unconscious, which is often people use as an excuse, is not the right thing, because we are morally and ethically responsible for the outcome of our actions. And I always say that intentionality shouldn't be the focus. Yes, you didn't mean to be racist or sexist, which a lot of people use as an excuse. But if it turns into a racist or a sexist action, that is absolutely crucial to this discussion here. So I think it's really important to understand how we separate intentionality and outcome, and how we sometimes hide behind the notion of unconscious. So even though the book is about unconscious biases, I'm unraveling a lot of myths around it, and the notion of bias, about what is bias and how it leads to prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, and all those things. There's a huge pyramid, and the top is this absolute kind of discriminatory behavior, and the systemic and structural things. And at the bottom are these biases that we carry in our brain as cognitive shortcuts, which we often employ. Like, even if I'm choosing a cereal, I would employ a cognitive shortcut, So
I actually read all those bits that you said, so that's good. But I was wondering, so I know what you mean by the cognitive shortcuts and the neuroscience of the brain and how the brain works. But I'm just wondering whether it would be helpful for people if you could just give us a bit of breakdown on how our brain is wired for automation and why. Because I think that often people look at unconscious biases as a bad thing. And what we always say is obviously that we are wired to be able to automate a lot of the things that we need to do. And I think that would be useful to explain to people. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. I can try and be as accessible as possible, which I hoped in the book as well. But when I look at evolutionary theories, we see that the whole notion of sometimes our prejudice comes from this in-group, out-group mentality, that we form a notion of tribes, we form a notion of community, we have confirmation bias, we want to stick together with people who are like us, who think like us, who act like us. And that kind of leads to group things sometimes that can create prejudice against anybody who's not out in our group. And there is an evolutionary basis to it. In the very, very distant past, our ancestors had to make really quick decisions about their limited resources. We are competing for them, and they had to decide who's a threat to them. And I think it's important to understand that maybe there is this instinct within us, but that is not an excuse now to excuse some of these behaviors, because we don't live in the same kind of world. We're not competing for the same kind of resources. And so we cannot use that as an excuse. But I wanted to give a background to how some of these things can be formed in us, and how the notion of fear and threat, which is evoked a lot by politicians sometimes and media, can lead us to be very prejudiced against people who are not like us. And we've seen that in a lot of political decisions that have been made recently. In terms of the brain, yes, I was talking about the system processing theory, which is like dual processing theory, which is system 1 and system 2. So the system 1 is when we have all these bytes of information coming at us, especially when we are distracted or tired, as I said, or making very quick decisions. For instance, we see in police or legal context, sometimes people don't take time with these decisions. When we are hiring people, sometimes we make very quick instinctive decisions about who we like and we don't like. And then what happens is that we process the information on a very kind of superficial level, and we carry these templates in our brain, which can be called like shortcuts, or they can be called stereotypes, or they can be called anything, but it's like a visual matching thing. So we match the information that's coming in, and we say that this happened in the past, this kind of person acted like this, so they're more likely to act like this, and we make this very quick decision. But if we take time with that, which is the system 2, then we can actually process it and be able to send that information to a deeper part of the brain, not just process it on the basis of the amygdala, which reacts a lot to fear and threat, but to other parts of the cortex of our brain, where we can actually take time and consider and weigh up different options and alternative options and move beyond these generalizations. And so the whole aim to understand, and we don't really know, even neuroscientists don't know how brain really works, and it's very difficult to map bias in it. But what neuroscience has shown, and I try to be as exhaustive in my research as possible and speak to as many neuroscientists, is that we can see some of these actions that are happening in the brain in terms of how we weigh up different people and how we make these actions based on race or sex or
that bit about face recognition I thought was very interesting, actually.
And accent, and we react more because for anything familiar evokes a feeling of warmth and comfort in us, while anything unfamiliar evokes a feeling of threat in it, and so we are again reacting in a kind of a fearful way.
Can I link this, because I think this is exactly the kind of discussion I was hoping to have. It's really hard, I think, to have a discussion in the here and now without talking about racism, which has always been there, but it's so current and so pertinent. And I suppose what I was thinking about was how the kind of prejudices and the belief systems that we have about groups are so hardwired that even when we take time to think and stop and consider, it doesn't necessarily mean that we make equitable decisions. So I just wondered whether you had a view on that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, racism, I'm glad people are finally talking about it. And it's not like it's suddenly emerged. It's been a long-standing thing. And because it's been there for so long, these stereotypes are so deeply ingrained in our society. So as you say, even if we take time with the decisions, we will not be able to move away from stereotypes. What we really need to do is to question these stereotypes that are there. Because as we see that there's research that shows that there are labels that are associated with people based on their skin color. So Black men are associated more with aggressiveness, or Black women with anger or threat or anything like that. And that is so deeply entrenched that a lot of research and research studies have shown that people react in that way. And I think media perpetuates that. So I give a very powerful example of the Hurricane Katrina thing, where and that is a very powerful example of how words and language can reinforce these stereotypes. They play on these stereotypes and they become so deeply entrenched in us that even when we think we are making rational decisions, we are still using those generalizations. And I think what we need to do is to really untangle and question some of these things very, very, very carefully. And before we start talking about racism and implicit racism and microaggressions, we need to really think about stereotypes. What stereotypes do I carry of certain people? How do I assign these labels? How do I lump people into a category or a group membership and homogenize them and think that everybody in this group is going to has a label, like all Asian Americans or Asians would be very good at maths, or all women would be very nurturing. And we all do that because that's a lazy way of dealing with the world,
I mean, we're programmed for the laziness. And I think the bits of the book that I've read would testify that it stacks up really well in terms of the arguments. But I was just wondering if something else lies behind the laziness, especially with racism, and I think that's, in my head, that's to do with this issue of advantage. And I think that what I've noticed, and I suppose our work is not only just to do with racism, but lots of other forms of discrimination. There's this moment in people when they don't want to give up what they've got. And actually, if I promote you, that means I'm not promoting somebody that might look like me, that I might have all of these stereotypes about how well I get on with that, whoever those imagined people are. So this bit about loss is kind of seems to be critical in terms of acting well or acting with greater equity. I mean, have you a view on that?
No, yes, and I definitely discuss that in the book in terms of power. Yeah, these hierarchies that are existing in the society. So who has power to make these stereotypes and to impose these stereotypes is a really important point. And research has also shown that people who are actually in the majority, who's supposed to be higher up in the hierarchy, social hierarchy, they are very quick to make these stereotypes and impose them, because a lot of their time or their cognitive load isn't taken up by dealing with stereotypes or discrimination themselves, perhaps, while people who are lower in the hierarchy take their time because they already are facing stereotype threat and they are more careful about imposing these stereotypes. And it is about loss. There's a bias about we don't want to lose. It's a status quo bias, status bias, that we want to hold on to what we think is our status and our privilege and our position. And I think the whole discussion about privilege is so important in this notion as well, I think.
So just before we continue, I'm just wondering whether or not there is anybody that wants to ask any questions or anything on the chat that we need to respond to. So I'm going to signal that and then maybe ask my follow-up question, and then maybe we can look at the chat in a minute or two just to see if anybody wants to come in. So I suppose one of the things that I was thinking about as you talked a little bit more about stereotypes is how then do we move away from this idea that I'm going to lose something and I'm going to lose the privilege that I hold. And I suppose one of the other things that I was thinking about was how our economy, the way in which our society is structured, it really locks in this idea of privilege. And is there some untanglement that we need to almost do on a bigger scale that will enable us to act better?
I'm really intrigued by this idea that our economy is enabling these high privileges, and I wonder if you could.
Yeah, I suppose. I think that the way that our economy is loaded at the moment, may be a very simplistic perspective, but I'll state it, is it works because some people obviously get very rich and very wealthy as a consequence of being able to use the economy of others that don't get so wealthy. But that also happens to me, and that's happened around gender, it happens around race. So the way that our economic configuration plays out, it supports, I think, this idea of people not being equal, but some people have to have more and to be in charge and to be better. So that's what I was thinking in my brain.
I mean, capitalism thrives on these power hierarchies, absolutely, and privileges, and people who hold privilege or have traditionally or historically held privileges, they are not just gatekeepers of maintaining those privileges and hierarchies. They also tell us how our identity should be shaped, how our past should be interpreted, how our history should be interpreted, what version of history should we belong to. Absolutely, so many things, and not just in terms of economy, but everything around it is maintained by these hierarchies. And so that is why there is this whole reluctance to topple these hierarchies, these statuses, because, as I said, it's the status bias, because people want to, and people who have these privileges want to hold on to them, of course. And that is why, although the notion of privilege is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, and when I in my talks talk about white privilege, people get very defensive and very upset about it. But it is so crucial to any discussions about race and racism, I think, because these intersectionality of privileges that we carry is how it determines what our place in the society is and what place of other people around us are, and how we deal with them and how they deal with us. And it's not just in terms of whiteness, but also sexuality and gender. And when these intersect, as I talk about in the book, the intersectionality is so crucial, and sometimes we forget that. So within Black people, maybe Black men and women might have different biases because of race and gender intersecting, or a gay Black man would have different biases and prejudices or different position in that hierarchy because of sexuality and gender and race intersecting. And I think in terms of moving forward, we have to have an honest discussion about privilege, and we all have to have an honest discussion about the intersectionality of biases and who is more prejudiced against than other. But these are very difficult conversations. So you cannot just assume that these will just happen naturally, because, and so I don't have any clear answers, but I think the conversations that are happening now and just teasing out these terms can be very useful, I think, because I know that when I try to explain white privilege to people by saying it's not that you haven't faced any obstacles in life, but it's that you have a racism proof bubble because of your skin color. And so any obstacles you faced are not due to racism. It's knowing that when you open a book, you're more likely to see a person who's like you or your skin color. When you walk into a room, you're more likely to know that you will not be the only person with that skin color. You're less likely to feel an outsider. You're less likely to carry that imposter syndrome that I don't fit in, I don't belong here, I don't deserve to be here. You're less likely to feel grateful for any opportunities that you come that way, and that's where the whole entitlement aspect comes as well. And so I think we need to be aware of these terms and what these terms represent, and then be able to recognize and reflect on our privilege, which will take time, I think.
Thank you. I do agree with you. I mean, we've got a question actually, and just before well, let me read out the question. It's someone called Rachel, and she says, really interested in both your views on what really makes change in organisations. I'm often pushed to run to unconscious bias in the short, well, something's blocking, in a short amount of time as possible as a tick box. Help me to make the argument for what really works. So I'm just going to give Pragya a tiny break before I weigh in. So we talk a lot about what makes change in organisations, and the discussion that you have just highlighted there on the whole issue about recognising people's your privilege is something I think that is this huge stumbling block. So we often ask to go into organisations because people are recognising that on equal distribution of resources and power within organisations, it impacts on well-being. It means that there's more sick days. You know, there's costs to that, and costs to the way that people feel within their organisations, which then has an impact on how they perform. I'd like to think this is all very much more about people's moral responsibility to each other, but often it isn't. But we go into organisations and people say, yeah, no, help us with change, but they do not want to change, and that's the struggle. The change they want us to effect is more to do with change out there than change internally, and I think that's the bit that people, the muscle, if you like, that people don't want to exercise. So they'd rather, talk about the diet than actually go on the diet in terms of that analogy. I think the other thing that we've noticed, and I'm going to write a blog about this because I just think it's really interesting, is how many emails we've had from organisations that have said, can we do unconscious bias training? Can we do unconscious bias training? And we've written something about unconscious bias training, which basically says, it mirrors what you've said in your book, actually, Pragya, that it isn't a tick box, it isn't an easy fix, and that actually the organisations, people within organisations need to actually understand, explore the way that their organisation is experienced, and then to think more critically about how they begin to dismantle what obstacles there are in there, or what attitudes and belief systems there are, in order to help to make it a better and more inclusive place to work. But I suppose the only other thing I was going to say is that unconscious bias training, therefore, in my view, it's 3 words that means a lot of stuff. So I've seen people that have just stood there with their slides, talked about the different types of biases, and that's what they consider to be unconscious bias training. So in answer to some of your question, Rachel, I think you need to be really clear what you're getting, because there's a lot of difference. There's a huge scale, a huge range of things that are going out there under the term unconscious bias training, and you need to think, what's the problem that I'm trying to fix? What's the impact that I want to have in my organization? And the conversations that we have with organizations start that way. We don't just say, here's unconscious bias training. But there's a question for you now. Can you see it?
And so yeah, I'm just going to answer what Rachel said, and following on from that, yeah, absolutely.
What do you want to answer? I'm just wondering, because
I'm just going to add to that a little bit.
Okay,
because yeah, I've been doing a lot of unconscious bias talks, and there are these people who've never even thought about biases within themselves, and I think that has always been my first step when I'm talking to 2,500 people this evening in the US federal government who've never thought about biases within themselves. And that's going to be a very uncomfortable conversation. And absolutely, and I talk and critique the IAT in my book and about the notion of training. And I talk a lot about how we cannot cure unconscious bias. And I think the aim of the book is that you can never eradicate unconscious biases or cognitive biases, because we need some of these biases. What we do with them and how they impact our decisions and why we need to reflect on them is something we need to think about. So I'm just going to move on to the next one about...
Yeah, there was the one about how, can you say more about how we have conversations around privilege?
How do I best initiate that as a person with privilege? And I think that's a huge first step, Kate, that you recognize that you have some privileges. I think the terms can be very misleading sometimes. I think the terms can cause confusion and doubts within people and defensiveness. And once they put up those barriers, then it's very difficult to get through. So I think initially just having a framework of these terminologies and definitions and about what you mean with privilege, and like I talked about the intersectionality of privilege and what privilege means and how that affects people in a very non-judgmental way, I think is the best approach. And that's how I do it. I talk about examples and I talk about case studies, and I show people rather than tell people that this is what you have and this is the privilege. And that makes them think and reflect on that, and in a non-defensive manner, in a way that they don't feel like they've been attacked by somebody to say you have privilege and I don't have privilege. And I think that's always my approach, and just using a very clear framework of terminology and definition, I think, at the start.
Thank you. I suppose I would add to that by saying I think that there's a challenge when you're doing work around anti-discrimination practice, of putting together the right bits of knowledge with the right methods and approaches, and the combination of those two change depending on what you're doing and who you're doing it with. But actually, I don't think there is a way of sugarcoating the fact that people have privilege. I think that it's important to do the prep work to try to make people feel less defensive. But the part of the defense is that people know they've got it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit that we have to work with. So I'm trained in process-orientated psychology. We have to work with the conflict of that, because unless people can go through that, they always are standing on the edge of it. And that means that they never move forward. We see people come up to the edge of this all the time, and we kind of go, well, you've done this before, why don't you move forward? So I think there's something about how we learn to walk in stuff that's a bit uncomfortable, a bit tricky for us, because otherwise we can't get to another place. We're just stuck. And I am so fed up with people who've read the books and can talk about privilege but haven't moved forward in themselves. And I think we just need to find ways to help people to do that. I think bias is one of the ways, but I just think that there's some conflict and uncomfortableness in ourselves that we need to go through.
I mean, the whole topic of bias and privilege is very uncomfortable, and people have to sit with their discomfort, and it is not to make people comfortable, but I think it's about how you broach that topic as well.
Absolutely.
And then how do you move forward? That action has to happen once they acknowledge, yes, this is actually right. But even if they don't get to that stage where they don't even recognize privilege or understand it, then it's very tricky. Saima says about recruiting Black and people of color, and absolutely, diversity is key. And diversity is very important, but diversity can become such a box ticking exercise again. Just having people Black and other minority ethnic communities doesn't really mean that those people have a voice, that those people have a say in policy making, those people can change the organizations. And we also know that a lot of people from Black community and also other minority ethnic communities can also internalize this racialization. And we know, as we are seeing with some South Asian representatives in our cabinet, that they can also be the voice or the spokespeople for whiteness. They have a goal to be proximity to whiteness, and so they're not going to bring those views that we think they're going to. And sometimes organizations use that as an excuse to say, yes, we have 50% people from Black and other minority ethnic communities, so we are very diverse. I don't believe that is enough.
No, I totally would agree with you there. There are a number of questions, and maybe we pick one up in a minute or two. And I'm really grateful, actually, for these questions. Daniel, I think I need to kill you because they're so hard, those questions. But let's go back. We'll go back to them. But thank you for them. I wanted to get onto this idea of the use of bias, and in particular, debiasing. And I wondered what you thought about that. You already said in the conversation that then biases are never going to go away. You're always going to have to be working on them. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about what people could systematically do to debias, because it's learned, we don't have to do it. How do we go about getting rid of some of this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a huge conversation in itself, so I don't think we have time to...
Listen, we've got 10 minutes. You can do it in 10 minutes.
All the methods. But I think awareness is the first step, and being aware of the biases is the first step. And that's why any kind of training that we say, unconscious bias training, has to be a consistent thing that's actually deeply rooted in the company's policies and ethos and values, rather than a 1 hour session or half a day session. That's the start. There are some other exercises people do, which is about creating empathy and about actively stepping into somebody else's shoes. So when we talk about microaggressions, that can be a tricky thing to vocalize and say, I felt offended when you say that, because the person might say, I just was a joke. Actually, you can't take a joke. And often that becomes like a kind of a gaslighting, because the person who's feeling offended becomes then very doubtful of their own oversensitivity, or whether they're overreacting, or whether they offended somebody. So I think research has shown that when people are told to actively step into somebody's shoes and think from that perspective, then it can create a feeling of empathy and more kindness and compassion, where they can understand their perspectives better. So that is just one exercise that sometimes is very useful when we're talking about microaggressions, especially in workplace cultures. But I think there are lots of other ways.
Yeah.
Again, depends on the context. It again depends on what the organization wants to get out of it. And what
we've been trying to work with mindfulness, actually, as a way to think about it as well, because it has deep historical practices as well. I'm just also looking at some of the questions that Daniel's helpfully forwarded from participants. And the two that I'm looking at are really to do with power. So there's one from Rebecca about, I guess we need to understand why people think they need the power, why they need to hold on to privilege. And it links very much to a question from Amandeep about capitalism, where the lives of people of colour have been devalued in the system to excuse, for all of the purposes you've said, sweatshops, mining, etc. And he's asking a question: how does unconscious bias work with this more historical framework and political and economical framework that continues to perpetuate itself today? So I suppose I would kick off, and I'll hand over to you if that's okay, because I think it depends on the content of the course. I think some unconscious bias stuff doesn't talk about history, it doesn't talk about where this stuff comes from, and so I think you can use unconscious bias as a way in to people understanding that there's a world out there that they don't see and they don't experience because the lens, their upbringing, what they're looking at, it's almost like having a pair of glasses that just see a certain set of stuff, really. And I think that when we've used bias as a tool, well, we've been able to help people recognize that there are lots of different worlds and different experiences that exist, and that their world and their experiences are very limited by what they have they've experienced and been socialized in. So I think that can be one way to use it. Pragya, do you want to have a crack at any of those?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it actually. About I mean, what is influencing this ingrained desire to be above or better there then? And I've talked about that, the status and hierarchies, and why people have this inherent need to do that in the book. So I'm not going to go into detail there.
Yeah.
But in terms of capitalism and in how does it work within this framework, I personally don't think unconscious bias training can really work in isolation without addressing some of these other things about history and about whose past are we looking at, and what is our identity and belonging and nationalistic identity.
It's the beauty of it, isn't it? I mean, that's why you would do it, really.
Yeah. And I think yes, when you say is there a limitation to unconscious bias training within a capitalist economy, I think we need to really tease out what unconscious bias training is, that what we've been talking about. And I don't like the word training, because I just don't like the word unconscious bias training, because I don't really know how you can train people to be. You're not training people, you're not curing people. You're taking the IAT, for instance, is not training people to be rid of unconscious bias. It's not reflection and awareness, and then people have to do a lot of the work themselves. Organizations have to do a lot of work themselves. They can't expect somebody to just come in and tell them what to do and educate them and not take the responsibility of doing this work every day. You know, I find that quite baffling that people still believe.
But I think that's why we are in the state we're in relation to equality. There's been so much, not just I mean, we're in this unconscious bias training state, and I agree with what you just said. But I think there's been so many different types of things that people have done as a one-off around getting individuals to understand how they operate and how they work with people and how they can be more equitable. And I think unconscious bias training is just another one of the suites of things. But I think your point is that how can any of that stuff on a one-off do anything? You know, it has to be something that's more deep-seated. People have to be able to pick it up and run with it, and to be encouraged to do so. I think part of the challenge we find is that organisations don't give people the space in which to explore this further or to develop themselves further. And the organisations is almost at odds with it. So sometimes when we do work around recruitment and best practice in recruitment, and we do some really careful stuff, and I think people are really sighted on what's better to do, the organisation then gives them 60 applications to shortlist in 2 days. Yeah, and then we think, well, why, you know, if you've got to do that, all of the biases come out, everything comes out. So I think organisations defeat themselves by the way in which they operate.
Yeah, and I agree that there's pressures on time, and people have to be quantifiable about the outcomes in terms of businesses and things like that. But there's also this this whole thing that I've seen when I've worked with organizations in terms of inclusivity, is that the people of color, or who are the minority, are supposed to do the work of educating everybody else. They are the ones who organize these equality committees within organizations. They are the ones who organize these trainings. And there's a flip side to it, because often people feel that it's only the people in the majority who need unconscious bias training. But what I really wanted to do with the book is to say that actually it's not just a certain kind of person who needs an unconscious bias training. It's everybody needs to reflect on it. And I think reading the book hopefully is the first step to it, and then you can think about what action to take from there, because that will give you that non-judgmental space, the safe space, the slow time to actually reflect on some of the things that we don't have when we are working in
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Isn't that woman that wrote the Blind Spot? I can't remember her name, but she's got an example in her book. She's done a lot of work on unconscious bias. I think she's Harvard in the States, and she talks about when they've done the test for bias, so race bias, that people from Black and minority ethnic communities, and I know there's no perfect language, but I'll just use that for the moment, are still biased against people who look like them, because we all have this stuff, and so this idea that you can just live through your life and be bias free and you don't pick this up, I think is quite it's something that I think we need to be awake to.
Yeah, and absolutely, I include that example. She's one of the team who actually came up with the IAT test. It was developed at Harvard, and yes, that has been shown by other examples where we do internalize some of this. We internalize the sexism, we internalize the racialized hierarchies. And because of these messages that we get, we are also biased against people who look like us. I've recently talked about anti-Black sentiment in the South Asian community as well, and within anti-Indian sentiment within some of the Black community as well. And I think it's not just a very black and white issue. That's all I want to say.
No, I agree. I was telling someone the other day that the term Black, people have forgotten that it had a political. It wasn't anything to do with, you know, how dark you were. You know, my father, who was from Indian heritage, called himself a black man. You know, it was a term of solidarity. It was a term of understanding racism and the oppression of racism. But I think we've got that. We've become very seduced by what we can get for our own groups and our own communities, and separating ourselves out from others as a way of advantaging ourselves, really. So is this the human condition? Are we doomed to do this forevermore?
I think there is a certain amount of selfishness, and there is which I also discuss in the book, about focus on ourselves, and put it comes from a desire to create a self-identity. And I think we all do that from a very young age. Children do that. They start creating this identity. But I do also believe firmly that humans are supposed to be good and kind and nice, and they want to do the right thing. And if you haven't read the recent book by Rutger, I think he wrote Humankind, it's really good book, because I think it kind of makes you feel positive and optimistic again. And despite all the things about groupthink and echo chambers and our biases, I think we still have this inherent desire to be good and kind, and I stay optimistic. So
I would agree with that, and I think that's a really good thing to begin to focus as we wind down, really, because I have seen some extraordinary acts of kindness through this lockdown, and I often say about my own life, the only reason I'm here today is because I've had some people being extraordinarily kind to me when they didn't have to throughout my life. So I do think we have this huge capacity. In terms of just sort of winding down, I'm just wondering which question. Oh, should we do this one? Being in the Department of Dreams, because this is what this festival is about. Can you share a thought about what might be the relationship between unconscious bias and our imaginations and social imaginations? And then there's another one about tactics to share these conversations with children. And having children myself, I've been having that conversation about how do we talk to children about this stuff? Because
yeah, I mean, in terms of children, yeah, absolutely, I'm passionate. I've got 3 girls myself. I've talked a lot about it. I wrote an article on Huffington Post a couple of years ago, especially as I'm raising multicultural children now. My twins who are 5, 4, 5, they're not.
How old are your twins? Let's be certain about this.
they recently turned 4, but they do act like they're 13. So, but no, I wrote about that, and I was on BBC Women's Hour talking about how we did talk about children, race and racism with our children. And then I've got a podcast episode on my podcast, Outside the Boxes, in which I cover the science. And in the book also, I talk about color blindness, because the main argument I sometimes get from people is children don't notice color. And I was recently told that I'm indoctrinating children and starting a cult by doing this, by talking about this. So children form a notion of, these again by facial cues.
About 3, they start to notice color, or is it earlier?
I mean, 6 months. 6 months they start noticing difference.
My son's a neuroscience, so he's always telling me this stuff. But
yes, 6 months they start noticing difference between what's familiar and what's not familiar. But 3 years, certainly these things start setting in. And if you get a chance, you should. I mean, I discuss it in the book, but I look up Jane Elliott's Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment.
Yeah, I remember when I started out in doing this work in back in the day when I was young and fit and everything worked. Jane Elliott was the person. It's interesting, isn't it, that we keep going back to that brown eyes, blue eyes experiment, because over and over and over again. Yeah,
because it shows in such concrete way what we will not be able to replicate now, because ethically we can't do that experiment now. And that is the whole problem with bias. We cannot really have clear evidence like this, because she separated children according to eye color and gave them one group certain privileges, and so quickly these prejudices started forming, and this notion of we are better started forming within group of children and treating others in a discriminatory way. And so I've written a lot about how we talk to our children about race and racism.
No, I'll definitely be having a look at that, because I actually started writing a book for my granddaughter on this, because I was fed up of American books about it, which I just thought whatever. And then I thought, well, how do you write about the fact that race is made up stuff?
Yeah.
You know, and actually lots of things talk about differences when we're all different. And how do you begin to get that nuance between helping her to understand who she is as a person and as a human being, and then what discriminatory attitudes and beliefs throw on top of her? And that's kind of hard. And I thought, you know what, I definitely need to think about how I talk to her about that. Yeah,
it's very tricky, because you don't want to make them feel like a victim, but you don't want them to make them feel like a villain either. And again, I think in an age appropriate manner, we have to talk about from a historical perspective. It creates power and privilege about how people perceive others, who mistreats. A National Slavery Museum has a lot of resources, which is in Liverpool, not in London. And
I took my children there, actually, when they were in their teens. I took them around Liverpool, and there was this fantastic man called Eric who'd spent his life looking at the buildings in Liverpool and learning to read the signs of history and slavery. And he takes you on this tour around Liverpool, and they've never forgotten it. They've all, and actually, even now when I'm with them, if we're somewhere, they'll look at the buildings and they'll be able to tell you the connection to the building. It's just a very powerful tool. I don't think I've done too badly. Maybe I didn't traumatize them as much as I thought. I thought I did.
I think sometimes people just don't have the privilege to not talk about race and racism with their children. I suppose when we talk about minority ethnic communities, we do have to prepare our children when they go out in the world. Although as a first generation migrant, I know that there was this inherent desire for me to kind of fit in and not draw attention to my skin color, because I don't want to create a fuss, and I don't want to feel like I'm a box that has been ticked and any positive discrimination has happened, and I wanted to be treated like anybody else. But that difference is always there. And I think we need to prepare our children to notice difference, but treat it in an equitable manner. I think that's what is really important.
Okay. Well, I think looking at the time, I don't know, maybe if you've got any final things to say, but I think we're due to finish in a couple of minutes. So anything that you'd like to say by way of closing?
I think we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves. And even though we talk about our systemic and structural things, and sometimes we might feel helpless that we cannot create change, I think all of us have an individual accountability and responsibility to do that as well, to create this shift, to create this change within ourselves and within our immediate environment and surroundings. And I don't really have any profound things, except if you read the book, let me know what you think.
Okay. And it is good. I mean, I haven't managed to get the round through, but I've been dipping in, and I like the real life examples, because I think it makes it much easier and much more accessible to read. And I suppose from our perspective, just finally, I think I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with you, and thank you very much for writing the book. I think that this work requires disturbance within us, and I think we need to be prepared to be disturbed and to recognize we can survive it. I think that there's something about some of our blocks really around this stuff means that we believe that we're not going to be able to get to the other side of this, and actually you can. You can do things that are uncomfortable and survive it, because we do it every single day as human beings. And I think we can do it around issues of equity. We can begin to think more critically about the bigger picture. We can begin to dream about a different society where more people were able to contribute and more people were feeling healthier and happier. And I don't want my children to live in a society that is worse than it is now. And I think that's something that I'm hoping to contribute to, and also hoping for the future.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Thank you so much, Joy. And it's been really
thank you.
And I think we do need to sit with that discomfort, which is absolutely crucial. And yeah, absolutely. It's creating a fairer world for my children, which my thing is, the book is dedicated to them, about because I owe you an unbiased world. And I think
that's a wonderful way to end. So I think we are going to close. Nikki, I don't think is going to come back on. So maybe we just need to leave, and to thank people for their questions, and to thank Daniel for his wonderful technical skill on this. It's the first time I've been on this platform, but I think it's really good. It's been very easy. So I'm just going to press leave and wish everybody a fantastic rest of the Dream Festival. Take care.
Thanks.